The year when Mussolini's once proud empire began to collapse under the weight of its own delusions. As the fascist regime fell, and Italy signed an armistice with the Allies, the nation found itself divided and humiliated. Hundreds of thousands of Italian soldiers, who had fought across North Africa, in Greece, and in the Mediterranean, suddenly became prisoners of war. Among them, more than 50,000 were shipped across the Atlantic Ocean, far from the chaos of Europe, to a place they barely imagined, the United States of America. When the transports docked at ports along the American East Coast, many of the Italian POWs expected hostility and vengeance. They had been told that Americans were barbarians, greedy capitalists, indifferent to suffering, ruled by corruption and chaos. Some imagined they would be worked to death in coal mines or starved in prison camps. But what awaited them was something very different. From 1943 to 1946, Italian prisoners of war were housed in over 60 camps scattered across the American heartland. From the pine forests of Georgia to the plains of Texas, from the snow-covered fields of Montana to the orange groves of California. The men came from every corner of Italy: farmers from Sicily, mechanics from Turin, students from Rome, fishermen from Naples. In America, they became part of a quiet, unexpected experiment, one that would challenge everything they had been taught about power, freedom, and civilization. At first, many were stunned simply by what they saw. Even in wartime, America seemed untouched by scarcity. Trains ran on time, food was abundant, and factories roared day and night. The prisoners were well fed, often better than the average Italian soldier had been during the war. They received medical care, clean clothes, and the unimaginable luxury of hot showers. In Camp Hereford, Texas, the Italians found neatly built wooden barracks, a dining hall, and even a small chapel. In Montana, the prisoners played soccer in wide open fields, surrounded by mountains that reminded them of home. Each camp had a library, workshops, and even orchestras. Some men studied English. Others learned to paint, sculpt, or play musical instruments. At first, this generosity was confusing. "Why do they treat us so well?" one prisoner wrote in his diary. "We are the enemy." But the answer lay in something deeper than policy. The Americans believed, or at least tried to believe, that even in war, a man's dignity could be respected. To them, the treatment of prisoners reflected the kind of civilization they fought to defend. For the Italians, it was a revelation. Many had grown up under a dictatorship that glorified obedience and punished independent thought. Now they were in a place where even guards joked with them, where newspapers criticized the government freely, and where civilians, ordinary men and women, could speak their minds without fear. In one camp, a prisoner recalled his astonishment when an American officer admitted, in front of enlisted men, that he might have made a mistake. "In Italy," he wrote, "an officer is never wrong. Here they laugh at authority, but they also respect it." That paradox, discipline without fear, freedom without chaos, fascinated the Italians. They saw black soldiers serving in the U.S. Army, women driving trucks and managing farms, and workers who argued openly with their bosses. For men who had been raised on fascist propaganda about the weakness of democracy, these scenes were disorienting. Some prisoners began to question what they had fought for. A Sicilian sergeant wrote, "I believed that strength came from command, from the douche, from the salute. But here I see another kind of strength, quieter but more powerful." The Americans noticed this transformation. The Office of War Information collected reports from camp administrators describing a growing sense of respect, even admiration, among the Italians. They no longer saw America as an enemy. They began to see it as a model. After Italy's surrender in September 1943, the U.S. War Department created a new category, the Italian Service Units. These were volunteers drawn from among the POWs who chose to work for the Allied cause. They took an oath of loyalty to the new Italian government, rejecting Mussolini's fascist republic, and in return they were granted greater freedom. By 1944, more than 30,000 Italian prisoners had joined these service units. They worked in military depots, on farms, and in factories, not as slaves, but as trusted laborers. Some helped repair vehicles, others built airfields, harvested crops, or packed munitions. For many Americans, the Italian POWs became more than workers. They became part of the community. Families invited them to dinner. Priests welcomed them into churches. In small towns across the South and Midwest, the presence of these polite, hard-working men from across the ocean stirred curiosity and compassion. One farmer from Arkansas recalled, "Those boys weren't our enemies anymore. They were just young men far from home." The Italians, too, were moved by the kindness they encountered. They wrote letters, thousands of them, to their families in Italy, describing what they saw. "In America," one man wrote, "even the poorest have shoes and meat on their tables." Another noted, "Here, no one bows to anyone. They are all equals, and yet everything functions." As weeks turned into months, the psychological effect deepened. What propaganda could not accomplish, simple daily life achieved. Living within a democratic society, even under guard, opened their eyes to an entirely different conception of civilization. When night fell, many would gather in the barracks to discuss what they had seen that day. They debated politics, religion, and philosophy. For some, it was the first time they could speak freely without fear of denunciation. The war had taken away their country, but captivity gave them something new: perspective. One prisoner summarized it simply: "We came to America as soldiers of Mussolini. We will leave as students of democracy." The American authorities noticed this gradual transformation. Reports from the War Department described a remarkable adaptation and a visible shift in attitude. There were very few escape attempts, almost no violence. The Italians worked diligently, studied English, and built friendships. Their morale was high not because of fear, but because of dignity. To many American officers, this was living proof that humane treatment could achieve what punishment never could: loyalty born not from coercion, but from respect. When the war finally turned in the Allies' favor, the Italian POWs found themselves witnessing history from the sidelines, but also participating in it in their own quiet way. They harvested food that fed Allied troops. They repaired tanks and trucks that rolled into Europe. They contributed, indirectly but meaningfully, to the defeat of Nazi Germany. Yet their greatest legacy was not material. It was moral. By 1945, as the camps prepared for closure, something extraordinary had happened. Many of the Italians no longer wanted to leave. They had built friendships with local Americans, learned the language, and discovered a society that, for all its flaws, offered something their homeland had never given them: a sense of possibility. When they finally boarded ships to return to Italy, they carried more than memories. They carried ideas about freedom, equality, and the simple dignity of ordinary people. One former prisoner later wrote in his memoir, "We lost the war, but perhaps for the first time, we learned what it means to be human." When the first transports carrying Italian POWs left American ports in the summer of 1945, many of the men wept quietly on deck. For 2 years they had lived behind fences, but those fences had come to represent something paradoxical: not just captivity, but also protection, order, even education. They were leaving behind not a nightmare of imprisonment, but a strange and unexpected chapter of enlightenment. The voyage home took weeks. On board, soldiers exchanged memories and rumors about what awaited them in Italy. Some had heard that their families were starving. Others feared being treated as traitors for having cooperated with the Allies. But most were filled with an odd sense of anticipation. They knew that when they returned, they would be different men. When they first stepped onto American soil in 1943, they had been loyal soldiers of a fascist regime. They had sworn oaths to Il Duce, fought in the name of empire, and believed in a vision of national glory that seemed eternal. Now, as they sailed back, that ideology felt hollow. They had seen another world, one built not on obedience, but on trust. Inside the camps, daily routines had quietly reshaped their understanding of society. There were no secret police, no propaganda parades, no mandatory salutes. Instead, there were rules based on fairness, discussions instead of decrees, and a subtle but powerful belief in human worth. In Camp Atterbury, Indiana, the Italian POWs ran a small newspaper written in both Italian and English. It reported on world events, sports, and even local American politics. The editors were amazed that the camp command allowed them to criticize government policies. In Italy, one of them wrote, such words would have meant prison. Another example came from Camp Monticello, Arkansas, where Italian musicians formed a symphony orchestra. They performed classical works and even composed new pieces. American officers attended their concerts, clapping alongside the prisoners. Music became a bridge, a symbol of shared humanity that transcended the war. In Camp Hereford, Texas, a group of prisoners built a model of an Italian village from clay and wood. It had miniature churches, vineyards, and streets, a memory of home preserved through art. Visitors were astonished at the detail. The prisoners explained that they built it not to escape their reality, but to remember who they were beyond the uniform. The U.S. Army encouraged these cultural activities, believing that engagement was better than repression. The more productive and respected the men felt, the fewer problems the camps had. It worked. There were, of course, moments of tension. Some prisoners remained loyal to Mussolini and refused to cooperate. They were often isolated in special compounds to avoid conflict. But even among them, time eroded fanaticism. Letters from home told of hunger, bombings, and political chaos in Italy. The myth of fascist glory crumbled in the face of real suffering. For many prisoners, the turning point came with the news of Mussolini's death in April 1945. His body, hung upside down in Milan, became the final symbol of a dream gone mad. In the camps, the reaction was muted. There was no celebration, but also no mourning, only silence. By then, the majority had already shifted their loyalty. They saw themselves not as fascists or enemies, but as Italians, and as men who had glimpsed another possible future for their country. The Italian service units, in particular, left a deep mark on this transformation. Working side by side with Americans, they experienced a kind of equality that would have been unthinkable in the Italian army. In one unit stationed near Chicago, an Italian corporal was invited to dinner by a local family. Afterward, he wrote, "I have never eaten like this. Not because the food was rich, but because they treated me as a guest, not a prisoner." In California, other units helped harvest crops during the labor shortage caused by the war. Farmers came to depend on them. Many of these relationships continued long after the war ended. Some Italians kept writing letters to American families for decades. There were also cases where love crossed the boundaries of captivity. Though officially forbidden, friendships, and sometimes romances, blossomed between Italian prisoners and local women. One famous story involved a young prisoner named Carlo, who met a farmer's daughter near Fresno. They exchanged letters hidden in baskets of fruit. After the war, he returned to Italy, but 5 years later, he came back to the United States, this time as an immigrant, and he married her. Their children grew up speaking both English and Italian. Stories like that were rare, but they captured the emotional depth of this unique encounter between two worlds. Even American guards were changed by the experience. Many had gone to war expecting to face brutal enemies. Instead, they found that the Italians were not monsters, but men very much like themselves. They shared meals, swapped songs, and told stories. For some Americans, it was their first human contact with a foreign enemy. It shattered their preconceptions too. A U.S. Army chaplain described it in his report. "We set out to imprison them. Instead, we discovered our own humanity." The camps themselves became microcosms of democracy in action. Decisions about daily activities were often made through committees, and prisoners were encouraged to elect representatives. When disputes arose, they were solved through discussion, not violence. The guards enforced discipline, but they also listened. In Camp Rupert, Idaho, Italian POWs built a small stage and performed plays, sometimes comedies, sometimes tragedies. They mocked Mussolini's speeches, with one prisoner wearing a fake mustache and shouting grandiose promises while the audience laughed. It was the first time many dared to ridicule the regime that had once ruled their lives. Outside the camps, the American public's attitude also evolved. Initially wary of housing enemy soldiers on their soil, local communities gradually realized that the Italians posed no threat. Newspapers published stories about their good behavior and hard work. Children waved at them through the fences. Some towns even held joint events with them after Italy switched sides. In Georgia, a local newspaper wrote, "They came as enemies and leave as friends." Not everyone approved. There were critics who argued that the prisoners were being treated too kindly. "They're living better than our own soldiers," one congressman complained. But the military insisted that humane treatment was not weakness, it was strength. It demonstrated to the world that democracy did not need cruelty to maintain order. This philosophy came from the top. The Geneva Convention required certain standards, but America went further. The War Department viewed good treatment as a tool of re-education, not through lectures, but through example. For the Italians, this unspoken lesson was powerful. They began to understand that democracy was not just a system of government, but a culture. A way of living based on respect, trust, and personal responsibility. By 1945, many POWs had learned English well enough to read American newspapers. They followed the trials of Nazi leaders, the death of Roosevelt, and the Allied push into Germany. They saw how Americans debated politics even during wartime, without fear of arrest. To them, that was revolutionary. When VE Day arrived, the camps erupted in cautious celebration. The war that had sent them across an ocean was finally over. Some prayed for the dead. Others dreamed of rebuilding their country. And as they prepared to return home, American officers asked them to fill out surveys about their experiences. The responses were astonishingly consistent. The majority said they now admired the United States. Many expressed a desire to bring what they had learned back to Italy. One wrote simply, "If Italy could learn from America, we might yet become a free people." That sentiment would later prove prophetic. When these men returned home, they became quiet but influential witnesses of a different civilization. In villages shattered by war, they told stories of abundance and equality, of libraries in prison camps, of Americans who treated them as men and not enemies. Some entered politics. Others became teachers, farmers, or labor leaders. In subtle ways, they helped shape the spirit of post-war Italy. The Italy that would choose democracy over dictatorship. But in 1945, as their ships approached the ruined shores of Naples and Taranto, they could not yet know this. They only knew that they were going home to a country they barely recognized. They were no longer the same men who had marched into Africa under Mussolini's banner. They had been transformed, not by defeat, but by exposure to a different way of life. And though history would rarely mention them, their story stands as one of World War II's quietest triumphs, a victory not of weapons, but of values. As the Italian POWs disembarked in Naples, Genoa, and Taranto in the late summer and autumn of 1945, they stepped into a country that had been reduced to dust and hunger. The once proud cities of Italy were now shadows of themselves, bridges blown up, railroads torn apart, and factories in ruins. The smell of burned fuel and desperation filled the air. People stood in endless lines for bread that never came. Children with hollow eyes begged along the streets. The returning prisoners were stunned. They had spent 2 years behind barbed wire, but those fences now seemed like protection compared to what awaited them at home. The American camps had given them food, books, music, and hope. Italy, in contrast, felt empty. One former prisoner, writing in his diary upon arrival, put it plainly. "In America, even the prisoners lived like men. Here, free people live like beggars." Their uniforms were ragged, their boots worn, but what truly set them apart was not their appearance. It was their attitude. They had seen democracy in action, felt dignity even in captivity, and now carried that invisible wealth back with them. At first, many Italians didn't believe their stories. When the returned POWs spoke of American farms with tractors, of women driving trucks, of black and white soldiers serving together, of guards who treated prisoners politely. They were met with disbelief. "Impossible," people said. "You were in a different America." But it was true. These men had witnessed something their homeland had never known, a culture of respect that didn't depend on fear. In the villages of Sicily and Campania, some of the returned POWs began sharing what they had learned. They showed farmers how to organize cooperatives, how to use modern tools, and how to plan harvests efficiently. Lessons they had picked up while working in American fields. In northern towns, others began forming community groups to repair schools and rebuild local councils, inspired by the idea of self-governance they had seen inside the camps. To outsiders, these were small gestures. But in a country recovering from 20 years of dictatorship, they were revolutionary acts. The transformation was not immediate nor universal. Some Italians, bitter from war and defeat, dismissed the returnees as collaborators or cowards. They called them gli Americani, not as a compliment, but as an accusation. The war had divided Italy into fascists, monarchists, and partisans, and suspicion ran deep. Yet over time, as Reconstruction began, the quiet influence of the former POWs spread. They had seen that authority did not have to mean cruelty, and that discipline could coexist with freedom. Those lessons resonated with a new generation eager to rebuild Italy from the ruins. Historians later observed that the Italian prisoners in America represented a kind of invisible bridge between two worlds, the old Europe of hierarchy and control, and the new order of democracy and cooperation. To understand the depth of their transformation, it helps to look at their writings, letters, journals, and memoirs preserved in archives across Italy and the United States. These documents, often written in simple, emotional language, reveal a psychological journey as dramatic as any military campaign. A prisoner named Giuseppe R. from Florence described his first glimpse of an American town from the train window en route to a POW camp in 1943. "I saw houses all with windows of glass, gardens full of fruit, children in clean clothes, and people smiling. Even though the war was on, I saw no fear in their faces. That day I understood why we had lost." Another, an officer from Sardinia, recalled his astonishment when he discovered that his American guards received the same food as he did. "It was not a trick," he wrote. "They truly believed equality meant something." There were also accounts of quiet kindnesses that changed hearts more than any speech could. A prisoner who fell ill in a camp hospital in Nebraska wrote that a nurse read to him from the Bible every evening. "She spoke slowly so I could understand. When I cried, she held my hand. No one in Italy had ever done that for me." Even the way Americans handled religion left a mark. In fascist Italy, the church had often served as a pillar of the regime. In America, faith seemed personal and voluntary, an expression of choice, not of duty. Italian POWs attended Protestant and Catholic services, sometimes together, and were surprised to see chaplains preaching tolerance instead of obedience. The contrasts accumulated, reshaping their worldview. "The Americans," one wrote, "do not believe that the state owns them. They believe they own the state." Such statements, simple but profound, would echo in post-war Italy's rebirth. The American authorities had not planned for this ideological transformation to be so effective. What they sought, at most, was stability in the camps and perhaps some useful labor. What they achieved, almost by accident, was a large-scale civic education program. Not through propaganda films or pamphlets, but through daily life. When U.S. officials reviewed reports from the Italian POW system in 1946, they noted the unusually high morale and cooperation of these men compared to other Axis prisoners. The conclusion was clear. Humane treatment had fostered loyalty and respect. One report stated, "Their experience among us will be a quiet but lasting testimony to the power of democratic example." And indeed, it was. After the war, the Italian government, now democratic and fragile, faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding not just infrastructure, but trust. The memories carried home by former POWs became part of that process. Some of them took jobs in local administrations. Others entered education or journalism. A few even entered politics, bringing with them the belief that authority should serve the people, not the other way around. The story of these men never made headlines. It didn't fit the traditional narrative of war heroes or dramatic battles. It was not a tale of victory on the battlefield, but of quiet enlightenment in captivity. Yet, in its own way, it was just as important. In the decades after 1945, researchers began to see patterns. Communities where many former POWs returned often showed stronger civic participation, earlier establishment of cooperatives, and faster recovery. Sociologists traced these phenomena to the attitudes the men brought back from America, a belief in initiative, fairness, and responsibility. Of course, life in post-war Italy was harsh. Jobs were scarce, inflation soared, and politics turned violent as communists, monarchists, and Christian Democrats fought for control. But even amid this chaos, a subtle current of optimism ran through the words of those who had seen another world. One prisoner's memoir from 1947 captured that feeling. "We lived for months in a land that treated us as men, even when we were their enemies. That memory gives me faith that Italy too can become such a land." There is a remarkable story from 1946 in the small town of Ortona. A group of returning prisoners gathered the townspeople and proposed building a new library. They had been inspired by the camp libraries in Texas and Montana, where they first read Shakespeare and Dante side by side. The townspeople agreed. The library was built, and for years its shelves carried a handwritten note inside the first book, dedicated to those who found freedom behind fences. These quiet acts of rebuilding became the true legacy of the Italian POWs in America. And yet, for many of the men, memory was bittersweet. They knew that their experience of America had been shaped by war, by an artificial world inside the camps, protected from the complexities of real American life. They had not seen segregation in the South, or the struggles of the poor in the cities. They had seen the best of America, but that too had power. Because what they saw was the ideal that America wanted to believe in, and that ideal was enough to inspire hope. Even decades later, former prisoners would write letters to their American hosts, thanking them. Some returned as immigrants, building new lives in the country that had once held them captive. One such man, Antonio D., who had been imprisoned in Utah, settled in Chicago in 1952. When asked why he came back, he replied, "Because in America, I learned to walk without fear." His words could have spoken for thousands. In the years immediately following the war, the memory of captivity in America became a quiet yet powerful undercurrent running through Italy's recovery. Newspapers rarely spoke of it, and the government, preoccupied with reconstruction, offered no official recognition. Yet, in villages from Calabria to Lombardy, in cafes and family gatherings, stories were told of the faraway land where enemies treated prisoners with decency and where freedom seemed as natural as air. For the men who had lived through it, those stories were a form of light in the ruins. In many ways, the Italian POW experience in America served as an informal education in democracy, one that no school or government program could have designed. It was not taught, it was lived. Back home, these men faced daunting realities. Italy was divided politically and spiritually. The scars of civil war between fascists and partisans were still raw. Families had lost sons, fathers, and brothers. Entire towns were leveled by Allied bombings. In this shattered world, the former prisoners found themselves carrying a new kind of responsibility. To rebuild not only structures, but also the very idea of what Italy could be. Some of them spoke openly about their experiences. Others stayed silent, fearing misunderstanding or accusations of betrayal. For many Italians who had suffered under the fascist regime or fought with the resistance, the notion that prisoners of war, men who had once served Mussolini, might now claim moral insight seemed absurd. But time softened those divisions. In rural regions, particularly in the South, the returning POW's influence was most visible. They brought back practical skills learned in the camps, carpentry, machine repair, modern agricultural techniques. American camp programs had taught them not just English, but efficiency. They had learned to plan, to delegate, to think in teams. When they applied these lessons at home, productivity improved. In Campania, a farmer named Michel, who had spent 2 years working in an American Agricultural Service unit in Kansas, introduced new irrigation methods that doubled his harvest. Neighbors soon followed his example. When asked where he had learned it, he replied, "From my prison guards." Others brought back less tangible lessons about fairness, integrity, and cooperation. In a small town near Bologna, returning soldiers formed a community group to clean the local river and rebuild a destroyed bridge. They called it the Brotherhood, a term borrowed from the mutual aid spirit they had observed in America. Their motto was simple: we repair together, or we fall apart. There were also artistic legacies. Painters, sculptors, and musicians who had developed their talents in captivity carried them home. In 1946, a small exhibition opened in Florence displaying works created by former prisoners. The paintings showed scenes of camp life, barracks under snowy skies, guards playing cards with prisoners, a group of Italians playing soccer in a dusty Texas field. Critics noted the calm dignity in those images. "These are not works of despair," one wrote, "but of rediscovery." Perhaps the most profound influence of the POW experience, however, was psychological. Living for years in a place where authority was exercised with restraint and law replaced violence had changed how these men perceived power itself. In Mussolini's Italy, power had been something to fear. In America, it had seemed, at least within the camp system, something to respect but question. That subtle distinction became foundational in their post-war thinking. A former officer from Naples later recalled, "When an American sergeant spoke to me, he did not shout. When he punished someone, it was written down, justified, explained. I thought, if this is how even a war prisoner is treated, how then must a citizen be treated? That question never left me." For many, this question evolved into action. Some joined the newly formed Christian Democratic Party, which emphasized social justice and moral governance. Others leaned towards socialist movements, hoping to build a fairer society. Though they disagreed on politics, they shared a belief in moderation, a rejection of extremism on both sides. Scholars who later studied these men noticed a consistent pattern. Former POWs in America were less likely to support authoritarian parties and more likely to participate in civic organizations. They had seen democracy work, not as an abstract idea, but as a daily practice. Their letters reveal how personal this realization was. One wrote to a fellow veteran in 1947, "You remember how we used to say that freedom was a luxury? Now I know it is the only thing that keeps a man human." Yet even as they spread these new ideas, the former prisoners carried wounds. Many struggled with guilt for having fought for a lost cause, for surviving when others hadn't, and for feeling gratitude toward those who had been their enemies. Some found it difficult to reconcile their admiration for America with the devastation the Allies had inflicted on Italy through bombing campaigns. The contradiction was painful but real. For others, captivity had left a strange nostalgia. Not for the war, but for the sense of order and purpose they had known in the camps. Life in post-war Italy was chaotic, uncertain. The discipline of the American camps, paradoxically, had felt secure. One former prisoner admitted, "Behind the wire, I felt small but safe. Outside it, I feel free but lost." Still, the majority refused to dwell on bitterness. They looked forward. The years between 1946 and 1950 were marked by tireless rebuilding. Across the country, new factories rose, fields were reclaimed, and railways restored. Italy, once a defeated nation, was reborn. And among the invisible architects of this rebirth were the men who had learned about freedom from behind American fences. In 1948, when Italy held its first truly democratic national elections, millions of citizens voted in a spirit of hope. Historians have suggested that among them were tens of thousands of former POWs who carried with them a deep understanding of what those votes meant. They had seen a society where elections were real, where power changed hands without bloodshed. That memory gave them faith in the fragile experiment that was the new Italian Republic. As Italy entered the 1950s, its relationship with the United States deepened through the Marshall Plan. Once again, ships crossed the Atlantic, this time not with prisoners, but with aid, machinery, and ideas. American advisors arrived to help rebuild industries. Many Italians, remembering how their countrymen had been treated in captivity, viewed these efforts with cautious respect rather than resentment. The seeds of trust had been planted years earlier in those quiet camps scattered across America's heartland. The story of the Italian POWs became, in retrospect, an example of what some historians call victory through values. It demonstrated that democracy's strength did not lie in its armies alone, but in its capacity for empathy. A 1953 U.S. Army report reviewing the wartime POW program described the Italian case as a unique success in human rehabilitation. The report concluded, "The Italians were conquered not by force, but by example. Their respect was earned through fairness and consistency." One might argue that this transformation worked both ways. The Americans, too, learned from the Italians. In the middle of war, surrounded by propaganda and fear, they discovered that even an enemy could be honorable, cultured, and humane. Some guards wrote home about friendships formed across the fence. "If I didn't know better," one wrote, "I'd think these fellows were from our own towns." Same humor, same decency. These exchanges, quiet and personal, humanized both sides. They suggested that civilization could endure even in the heart of conflict. For the Italians, the lessons of captivity remained alive in their memories long after the camps were dismantled. In old age, many would tell their grandchildren about the strange time they spent in America, how they played soccer in the Texas dust, how they ate white bread for the first time, how they saw electric lights that never went dark, even during war. Those stories, passed down through generations, became part of Italy's post-war mythology, a reminder that even in defeat, dignity could be rediscovered. Perhaps the most haunting testimony came from a prisoner named Luigi, who wrote decades later, "When I was captured, I thought my life was over. But in America, I learned something my country had never taught me. That freedom is not given by leaders, but by how we treat one another. I was a prisoner of war, but also a student of humanity." By the late 1950s, the generation of Italians who had once been prisoners of war in America began to grow older. Many had families, small businesses, or jobs in the industries that were fueling Italy's post-war miracle. They rarely spoke publicly about their years behind barbed wire, not out of shame, but because it felt like a deeply personal chapter. Yet their experience quietly shaped the values of post-war Italy more than anyone realized. Their children grew up hearing strange, almost unbelievable stories of enemy guards who shared cigarettes, of libraries inside prison camps, of evenings spent listening to American jazz on a camp radio. For the next generation, born into peace, it sounded like fiction. But for the men who had lived it, those memories were real as the hunger, the fear, and the rebuilding that came after. The Italian government, eager to move forward, rarely mentioned the POW experience in official histories. It was easier to celebrate resistance fighters, martyrs, and generals than to honor men who had been captured. And yet, quietly, the former prisoners helped build the moral foundation for Italy's new democracy. They understood that power without compassion leads only to ruin. Some became teachers, shaping the minds of post-war youth. Others became local politicians or labor organizers. Many joined the cooperative movement that swept across rural Italy, helping peasants share resources and tools. In their meetings, they repeated ideas they had first encountered in America, about fairness, responsibility, and collective progress. One former POW named Ernesto from Bari helped organize a cooperative bakery. He told his workers, "In America, Even prisoners took turns deciding the rules of the camp. If they can do that in war, we can do it in peace. Such ideas, simple yet profound, echoed across a generation. There was also an intellectual legacy. In the early 1960s, Italian scholars began publishing memoirs and studies about the POW experience. They examined diaries kept secretly in the camps, correspondence between prisoners and their families, and American military records. What emerged was a complex portrait, one that challenged old assumptions about captivity, defeat, and moral strength. Historians found that the Italian POWs' exposure to American society had accelerated their nation's post-war democratization. Unlike German prisoners, who often experienced captivity as humiliation, Italians described it as revelation. They had seen firsthand the practical results of a society that valued education, technology, and personal freedom. One report from the University of Rome in 1962 concluded the Italian POWs in the United States returned not broken, but re-educated. Their experience abroad became a moral resource during Reconstruction. But for the prisoners themselves, the most vivid memories were not about politics or economics. They were about people. They remembered the camp chaplains who treated them like souls, not numbers, the American guards who shared Christmas dinners through the fence, the townspeople who invited them to Sunday Mass or brought them coffee. In Camp McLean, Texas, one group of prisoners built a wooden nativity scene in 1944. It was so beautifully crafted that local Americans came to see it. The next year, when the Italians were transferred, the townspeople kept the nativity and displayed it every Christmas for decades. For them, it became a symbol of reconciliation, a reminder that kindness could exist even between enemies. Another story, from Camp Atterbury, tells of an American guard named Tom, who lent his harmonica to a young Italian named Paolo. Paolo learned to play it so well that he performed for both prisoners and guards during evening gatherings. When the war ended, Tom gave him the harmonica as a gift. Years later, Paolo's grandson found it in a drawer and learned the story of how music had bridged two worlds in wartime. These personal memories, multiplied by thousands, formed an invisible network of shared humanity stretching across the Atlantic. Meanwhile, in America, the memory of the Italian POWs faded quickly. The camps were dismantled, the barracks torn down, and the farmland returned to normal use. Most Americans moved on, unaware that their brief encounter with the prisoners had left such a deep impression overseas. Yet, in some small towns, traces remained. In Georgia, a few locals still tended the graves of Italians who had died in captivity, from illness, accident, or homesickness. In Texas, murals painted by prisoners survived in churches and barns. Decades later, historians would rediscover them. Images of saints, olive trees, and distant Mediterranean hills, painted by men dreaming of home. Back in Italy, those who had lived through it carried those dreams quietly until the end of their lives. One recurring theme in their memoirs is gratitude, not to the war, but to the unexpected humanity they found within it. A former officer named Vittorio, who had been captured in Tunisia and sent to Nebraska, wrote shortly before his death in 1971, "I was an enemy of America, yet America gave me bread, books, and dignity. That contradiction taught me what civilization truly means." His words echoed what many others felt, but could not express. As time passed, Italy's relationship with the United States evolved from wartime enmity to alliance. Both nations became partners in NATO, and cultural exchange flourished. Films, music, and literature from America flooded Italy, influencing art and politics alike. For many Italians, this post-war fascination with America was not just about style or power. It was rooted in something older, born in the camps of 1943, 1945. It was a memory of decency under duress. In the 1980s and 1990s, as historians revisited forgotten aspects of World War II, the story of the Italian POWs in America resurfaced. Documentaries and local museums began collecting testimonies. American towns uncovered letters from the prisoners who had worked their fields. Families found photographs of young Italians smiling beside American farmers, Their uniforms faded, but their expressions relaxed, even joyful. In 1993, the 50th anniversary of the first Italian POW arrivals in the U.S., a ceremony was held in Camp Atterbury. Survivors, both former prisoners and guards, met again after half a century. They embraced, cried, and spoke of those strange, transformative years. One American veteran said, "We thought we were teaching them democracy. Maybe they taught us humanity." It was a moment of symmetry, a circle completed. By then, most of the former prisoners were elderly. Many brought their families, introducing them to the people and places that had shaped their youth. Standing before the remnants of their old barracks, they told their grandchildren how they had once believed the world ended at the edge of a fence, until they learned that kindness could cross even that barrier. As one of them said that day, "We went to America as soldiers of a dictator. We returned as men of peace." Even now, decades later, that sentiment carries weight. It captures the essence of what made their story unique. That in the middle of humanity's darkest war, something luminous was born, not on the battlefield, but in the quiet daily encounters between captor and captive. The Italian POW story remains one of the few instances in history where defeat became education, and captivity became a classroom for freedom. When we think of World War II, we often remember the destruction, the tanks, the bombings, the millions of dead. But the story of the Italians in America reminds us of another truth, that even amid the machinery of war, individuals can choose decency. That kindness, when shown to the enemy, can plant seeds that outlive the empire that fell. As one prisoner wrote long after the war, "We learned that power fades, but respect endures. It crosses oceans and survives generations." In the final years of their lives, many of the Italian prisoners who had once crossed the Atlantic found themselves reflecting on the strange journey that had shaped them. For them, the war was no longer just history. It was memory, sharpened by time into something deeply human. They had gone to America in chains, and yet, in the quiet paradox of history, they came home freer than when they left. In oral testimonies collected in the 1990s and early 2000s, these men often began their stories the same way, with disbelief. "When we arrived," one recalled, "we were certain they would hate us. We had been told that Americans were cruel, godless, greedy. And then we saw the opposite, a country full of work, discipline, and dignity." It was that reversal, that moral inversion, that left the most lasting impression. The prisoners' first shock was not the strength of America's weapons, or the size of its factories. It was the sight of ordinary people living without fear. One remembered walking past an American newspaper stand in 1944 and seeing headlines that criticized President Roosevelt. "I thought it was a trick," he said. "In Italy, such a paper would have been burned. There it was sold on every corner." Others recalled smaller moments that stayed with them forever. An American guard sharing his lunch, a farmer thanking them for their labor, a librarian in a camp who told them they could borrow any book they wished. "You are men," she said. "Men must think." Those words, one prisoner later wrote, were more powerful than any sermon. For many, it was the first time they had been treated not as tools of a regime, but as individuals capable of thought. The impact of that discovery rippled through their lives. Long after the war, in small Italian towns, these men became the voices of moderation, the ones who counseled patience when tempers flared, who valued discussion over slogans, who taught their children that patriotism meant service, not submission. Historians today often describe the Italian POW experience as a quiet revolution. It was not fought with weapons or decrees, but with exposure to a different way of being. When thousands of men from a militarized, hierarchical culture suddenly lived within a democratic one, even as captives, the result was transformation. They saw that order did not require oppression, that prosperity did not require conquest, that pride could exist without cruelty. This realization was reinforced by the material abundance they witnessed. The endless trains of supplies, the factories running day and night, the organized efficiency of American life. All of it contrasted sharply with the poverty and bureaucracy they had known in fascist Italy. One former prisoner later wrote, "We were told that democracy made people soft, but America showed us that freedom can build more than fear ever could." Those who returned to Italy brought that conviction home like a secret weapon. It influenced not only their personal lives, but the nation's post-war culture. The Italy that emerged from ruins, artistic, industrious, passionate, yet democratic, owed part of its spirit to the lessons learned by these 50,000 men behind American fences. The transformation was not complete or perfect. Italy still faced corruption, inequality, and political division. But beneath it all ran a current of pragmatism and humanity, a belief that dialogue and compromise were virtues, not signs of weakness. It is telling that when post-war Italian leaders debated the new constitution in 1946 to 1947, the principles they enshrined, equality before the law, protection of workers' rights, freedom of thought, echoed many of the values that the former POWs had seen practiced in America. Some of those leaders themselves had been prisoners abroad. In this way, a chain of invisible influence linked the barbed wire camps of Texas and Montana to the birth of the Italian Republic. For decades, the story remained obscure, overshadowed by the grand narratives of battles and politics. Only in recent years has it begun to receive the attention it deserves. In 2010, the Italian government and several U.S. states organized joint commemorations honoring the friendship born between captor and captive. Surviving veterans, now frail and gray, were invited to return to the sites where they had once been imprisoned. One such event took place in Hereford, Texas, where a memorial plaque now stands. It reads, "To the Italian prisoners of war who found here not enemies, but humanity. May their memory remind us that even in war, respect is the seed of peace." The ceremony drew both Italians and Americans, including descendants of the guards and local families who had known the prisoners. Some brought old photographs, young men in uniforms, smiling beside tractors, playing soccer, painting murals. The images spoke of something more powerful than ideology, the endurance of kindness. A retired American farmer, who as a boy had watched the Italians work his father's fields, said, "They taught us songs. My mother used to bake them bread. I never forgot how polite they were. We were told they were enemies, but they acted like neighbors." Moments like these reveal why this story continues to resonate. It stands as evidence that compassion can survive even in systems built for war. That moral victories often happen quietly, far from the front lines. When asked what they had learned from captivity, most of the former prisoners gave simple answers. That dignity is possible everywhere. That no one is born an enemy. That freedom must be lived to be understood. These were not the words of politicians or philosophers, but of men who had seen civilization collapse and be rebuilt from the ground up. By the time the last of them passed away, the world they had known had vanished, the camps demolished, the guards gone, the memories fading. Yet the moral of their experience remained. It endures in archives, in letters, in the quiet pride of their descendants who still tell the tale of how their fathers found democracy behind barbed wire. It endures, too, in the landscapes of America. In the Midwest, traces of their presence still surface. Bits of pottery, initials carved into trees, murals painted on forgotten walls. Each one is a fragment of a conversation between two civilizations that met in war, but parted in understanding. Their story challenges the way we think about victory. In war, victory is usually counted in cities taken or armies destroyed. But for these Italians, the true victory was moral: to lose a war and still gain wisdom. They left Italy as soldiers of a regime that had promised glory through domination. They returned as men who believed that greatness came from freedom, from fairness, from faith in human worth. Theirs is a story that belongs not only to Italy and America, but to humanity itself. A reminder that even in times of hatred, the possibility of compassion remains. A final entry from one prisoner's diary captures this spirit better than any historian could. In the end, they did not teach us democracy with words, but with how they lived. We saw it in their patience, in their order, in their laughter. We saw it in how they treated us, not as enemies, but as men. And that was enough to change us forever. As the pages of history close on that era, the lesson still stands, that wars end, nations rise and fall, but the quiet triumphs of decency endure. They do not make headlines, but they build the future. The Italian prisoners of war in America proved that humanity's greatest victories are often the ones fought not with guns, but with grace. They entered the camps as instruments of a fallen empire. They left as witnesses to another civilization, one that taught them, through example alone, that the true measure of strength is how a nation treats even those who can do it no harm. And when they returned to the shattered fields of their homeland, those lessons became seeds, small, invisible, but alive. Seeds that helped grow a new Italy. And with it, a new faith in mankind's capacity to learn, even in the darkest of times. Because sometimes, the most enduring victories are not won on the battlefield, but in the human heart.